Episode 88, talking about the resurrection. This is Matthew, and before we get into this conversation with Ed Atkinson, I'd like to first say welcome and thank you to those who have arrived here following my appearance on Justin Brierley's podcast, Unbelievable. Since that went out a week ago, we've had an average of about 100 extra listens per day to Still Unbelievable. Please continue to listen. We have some interesting episodes coming up. There is our conversation with Justin, which will be episode 90. We have a conversation with Tim O'Neill from History for Atheists, and we have a conversation with an author of a book on parenting through deconstruction. We are also hoping to schedule a further conversation with Mike DeVirgilio to carry on the discussion he and I had on Unbelievable. If you don't know what I'm referring to, the link to the Unbelievable episode is in the show notes, along with links to Ed's Doubts Aloud podcast and other topics that are referenced. This episode is the first to be published since the Unbelievable episode, so if you're a new listener, it may help with context to listen back to episode 83, as that is the episode we refer to at multiple points. As always, please do check the notes for references to items that are raised during this discussion. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. And this time I believe this is a first for us, Andrew. We've had, not only have we had feedback on an episode, but we've had somebody so keen to give feedback, but he's come on as a guest to tell us about what we said on an episode. This is definitely a first, isn't it?
I think what that usually means, and what it means in this case, is we really screwed up somewhere. And we're about to be told off about it.
No. Speak for yourself there. Me, I'm never wrong. But if you want to accept wrongness, that is totally on you. I will not be getting in your way, because every time I've called out. Yes, absolutely. Because every time I call somebody out to fact check me, I've had no feedback. So that can only mean I've been right every time. Surely there's no other conclusion from that, is there?
So I'll tell you what, let's let the listeners weigh in on what that is.
All right, then you can fact check that, listeners. Right, so enough of the tease. So we have with us Ed Atkinson, who we know, Andrew and I know from days gone by. He might be new to some of our listeners. If he is new to some of our listeners, that means one thing: you have not read the book, Still Unbelievable. If the name Ed Atkinson means nothing to you, that is on you. Go to the website, reasonpress.net, and you can read the book for free. Or if you want to donate a small amount of money to American Atheists, you can go and buy the book for 99p over on Amazon and buy it. So welcome, Ed. How lovely to hear from you. It was a great pleasure to have your email. It's great to have you on voice. We'll introduce you properly, but say hello to our listeners.
Hi. Thank you so much.
It is absolutely a pleasure to have you, Ed. So, Ed, you wrote the chapter on the resurrection in the book Still Unbelievable, which is a response to some of your thinking on the resurrection. You've been on the podcast Unbelievable, who we existed to be a thorn in the side of. And you had a lovely chat on an episode of Unbelievable about the resurrection. And you wrote to us after Andrew and I put out that monster episode touching 3 hours, responding to people talking about the minimal facts about the resurrection. So this is your bag. This is something that you like to get your teeth into. And as a quick aside on the moment of that, at the beginning of that 3 hour episode, I put out a comment to listeners to say, if 3 hours was too much for you, or you had an opinion on 3 hours, to feedback and let me know, and I'll adjust my schedule and my cutting accordingly. I had a few people give feedback, and pretty much everybody said they either loved long episodes or they were very happy with long episodes, and they didn't feel strongly enough to ask that I make them short. So there will still be occasional very long episodes. If you digress from that feeling, if you have a stronger feeling on you'd really like them shorter and closer to 2 hours max, then please let me know, and I'll see what I can do about keeping as many people happy as I possibly can. But for the time being, feedback has definitely been 3 hour long episodes are fine. People are very happy with that. They enjoy that kind of length to get into stuff. So there will be some episodes of that length, but they won't all be that long. Obviously, there will be still the shorter ones as well. So back to Ed. So Ed, you sent us that lovely email. You sent us a Word document full of a couple of pages of notes that you wanted to go through. I guess let's just dive in, and you can talk us through about what you thought of our episodes, the points that you want to pick up and the clarifications you want to make.
Thanks. I will say something to begin with in praise of our Justin, because we're his sort of followers, even if we don't agree with him. And he did a much better job of presenting this minimal facts argument for the resurrection than the podcasters that you were responding to. What should we call them, just to make it easy in our discussion?
Knight and Rose.
Okay, Knight and Rose. I'll try and remember
So
that.
it's from the Knight and Rose show podcast. The link to their podcast will be in our resurrection episode. It's where we respond to the minimal facts. I don't have the episode number immediately to hand, but by the time you're listening to this, it'll be about half a dozen episodes back.
83.
83. Thank you, Ed.
I guess I'll give you a little bit of history. I was an atheist when I grew up, and I became a Christian as a teenager and got into church leadership. It was in a kind of charismatic evangelical sort of setting in Britain. I wasn't young earth on any of that far, but it was relatively conservative. And I did get doubts and decided they were growing and growing, and I decided to step away. I wanted it to be true, but I would step away, try and be neutral, look at everything. So that was in the mid-90s. And of course, the resurrection was a big one of the kind of big five or so of the topics to work through. After many years, actually, I'm in range of Oxford, and I joined an Oxford Theological College library, and they were very kind, lending me books and everything as I did all this work. I did end up thinking, okay, there's just not enough there to believe. And then I've, in the years since, I've got more and more, I suppose it's sort of washed out of my system, more and more confident of that there isn't a God, and certainly that Christianity isn't a true religion. In Oxford was where I found out about Unbelievable, and I was a sort of the right kind of person to be put up against. Do you remember Os Guinness? He was pushing a book, and they thought someone who was all fresh to it all would be quite a good idea. So that's my introduction to Unbelievable, and I really liked it and jumped in, and I've enjoyed all the episodes, or most of them, ever since. And I was around, and I got invited to talk with Tony Costa, who's I think Canadian apologist about the resurrection, and so I've done some work on that. And then the Still Unbelievable book came round. I was quite keen to join in with that and do the resurrection chapter.
And now you also do your own podcast as well, Ed.
Oh, thank you for mentioning that, Matt. We're called Doubts Aloud, and Andrew White, who's been on the show a few times, I think with Greg Boyd and Nabil Qureshi, and Francis Yanush has also been on a few times. And we're three of us, and we do podcasting together. We try to be respectful to Christians, but we're not trying to be balanced. We give the kind of, I suppose you could say, skeptical view. We have Christian guests who we're very nice to and don't have big barneys with. We just listen to them and have fun conversations.
So a quick note on your podcast then. So it's just to remind everybody who might be searching for it, it's allowed as in noisy, not allowed as in permitted.
No. Yes. Sorry. Yes. Allowed as in noise, not allowed as in permission. You're right. But obviously it's a pun on that. Doubts Aloud.
And you're definitely nicer than we are, because I've had to put the unclean flag on a couple of our episodes, and I'm certainly very happy to leave curse words and expletives in the edit. You guys are definitely much more pleasant and much more mild-mannered than we are, but no less great to listen to.
Oh, thank you. So this is the resurrection, and the modern way in evangelical circles is to argue for the resurrection using minimal facts. And the idea here, which I think needs to be just really cleaned up a bit so people know what's going on. Obviously, the author of all this is Gary Habermas from decades and decades ago. Mm-hmm. And he did such a good job, I guess, that it's become more and more influential. And then he's teamed up with Mike Licona in more recent decades. So they're the big two that are associated with it. And the idea is that you almost sweep away the Gospels and say, well, they're contested. Almost any story in the Gospels, you'll find someone who will say it probably didn't happen, within scholarship, that is. And Gary thought, well, let's just pick the facts that nearly all scholars agree with, both conservative scholars and non-conservative Christian scholars and agnostics and unbelievers. There's the whole range in there. Obviously, most of them are Christians of some kind. But let's go for one that nearly everybody agrees with. It's quite a wacky position to disagree with. And so, for example, the big one is that Jesus died by crucifixion. That is something that only someone who you could call a scholar would be Robert Price, I think, and Tim Carrier would be the only ones you would say wouldn't agree with that because they don't think Jesus existed. But pretty well everyone in scholarship will go with that.
Yeah, Richard Carrier would be another one.
Oh, did I say something else? I said Tim Carrier or something.
Look, if you did, it's my.
Carrier and Price are the famous two.
Right.
But I think the point, though, here is a point that I would want to make at this point, though, is crucifixion. It wasn't unusual. The Romans killed quite a few people by crucifixion and quite a few people who claimed special gifts for themselves. So crucifixion in and of itself does nothing to establish the personhood of Jesus.
Yeah, but you needed to establish the resurrection.
Yes, that is very true.
So that's why it's a minimal facts. Then there's another one which is pretty I would say in opposition to what you seem to be saying on your episode, that appearances or traditions of appearances that go early are accepted by all, or, nearly all. So James Crossley he's a complete non-Christian, and he famously said it was like golden evidence or something, so much better than evidence that you'd have for, say, even the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
And so we go down these lists, and the idea is that you don't ever include in this list something that people don't overwhelmingly agree with. The conversion of Paul is another one, and another one is that the church became established. So there's really not a whole lot more than that. There is this thing about James we could talk about, and what there isn't is the empty tomb. This is the first thing I'd like us to dive into, if that's okay.
Yep.
I wasn't sure how much Wintry Rose, no, Night and Rose.
It's Wintry Night and Desert Rose.
Yes, so Night and Rose were being clear on this, but by the definition of minimal facts, the empty tomb cannot be considered one. Habermas has said on Unbelievable, it changes a bit, but the last I've heard was a while ago on Unbelievable in 2015. He said between a quarter and a third of scholars will disagree with the empty tomb. So that's between 66 and 75% will agree. His website, meanwhile, gives the proportion of scholars who are conservative and non-conservative. I think you had a different term. I think skeptical scholars, and other scholars. Well, he splits it up between conservative scholars and others. So there'll be non-conservative Christians, agnostics, unbelievers, all the rest of it. And 75% of scholars in his method are in the conservative bracket. If 75% of scholars are conservative and only up to 75% of scholars agree that the tomb was empty, then this is not going to be a minimal fact. This is just something that conservative Christians believe.
Right.
And the background here, of course, I maybe you've probably mentioned it many times over the years on your podcast, that conservative scholars work in seminaries where it's a condition of employment that you have certain views. And like even famously Mike Lacona had to resign from his post because he suggested that the dead rising and walking the streets of Jerusalem, one of Andrew's favourite passages, was metaphorical. So even by saying that, he lost his job. So it really is not remarkable that you're finding a lot of scholars who are conservatives towing the line of the empty tomb. I mean, it just stands to reason. So this empty tomb thing is completely not a minimal fact. And if an apologist wants to convince somebody that it happened, they've got to go back to all the details of the arguments and not just say, oh, it's a minimal fact, so we don't need to argue for it.
Expanding on from that, hasn't Habermas also said that he changes the number of points that he uses according to the circumstances?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I wouldn't say that's a weakness. It's just if you're doing a 5-hour lecture, you might include a few more.
Right.
If you're doing a presentation to a school, you probably just do a few. Yeah. So, yeah.
But I think the thing, though, to pull out of what you've just said is being a scholar in a specific educational institution that requires as membership, or rather employment, adherence to a predefined set of beliefs is problematic and does weaken the claim that you've got all these scholars who say that this happened, because in some cases they have to.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one more thing alongside that, we are three skeptics. I think largely we would all support the idea that there's likely no God, or at least that we're not fully convinced, right? But just among the three of us, there would be a range of how strongly we held to that idea. And so even if Gary is right, and let's use the top number, and 75% of scholars accept an empty tomb, if we just, it doesn't tell us anything about how convinced that proportion of scholars is. I don't get terribly worked up, although it probably sounds like it. If somebody said, 75% of scholars think there was, okay. But it's really just a sort of way to wow people with numbers. There's not a lot of grading when you say something like that. And there probably should be. Right? There should probably be some more nuance other than just this 75% of scholars think there was an empty tomb or whatever. Just being aware that doesn't tell us a lot about that body of scholars.
Any fact that I would accept and is traditionally used by Lacona and Habermas and people and Justin would be well in the 90s, high 90s maybe percent. And what Gary Habermas is doing is looking to see the proportion of papers that make arguments in favour of something or against something, or clearly have the view of something, such as appearances were part of the tradition early on and whatever.
Right. On the matter of papers, is it fair to say that when you look at the numbers of papers that are written on this matter, you're going to expect a greater proportion of those papers to come from believing scholars and believing institutions versus skeptical scholars and skeptical institutions, because this isn't going to be something that you're going to find many skeptical scholars investigating and writing about. The people who are most interested in this subject matter are those who already believe it to be fact. So they're going to be the ones that write about it more. So isn't there a risk here that you're just picking up the dross, so to speak? You're picking up the sheer numbers of people who are writing pro passage, because that kind of paradigm is what's going to exist anyway.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's still a reasonable way of proceeding. However you measure it, if you're being honest, you're able to tell us what of these things are just generally accepted in scholarship of all kinds and which ones are disputed.
Right.
Are you familiar with Peter Enns, the Bible for Normal People? And
yes, I listened to his podcast for a while, then I just got bored of it. I found it so uninteresting, so I've given up, but I know who he is. Yeah.
So he's ex-evangelical, very strong. Well, he's strong in his faith still, and very strong on following scholarship. And he's pretty scathing of the kind of scholars that would be in theological seminaries and bound by job to say the right thing. He says it's not really scholarship in his view. I was quite surprised at how strong he said it all.
Yeah, that is quite strong.
Yeah. Okay. I want to point out a typical error that you get with kind of apologists who are not fully into the subject. And I think Knight and Rosa are in this category. And it particularly applies to the appearances. So scholars will say as a pretty well agreed fact that some early disciples had experiences which were reported as appearances. And so appearances become minimal facts. And then they start to say, OK, how do we explain all these minimal facts with different ideas? And they will suddenly leap into a gospel story. So they would assume that the gospel story, say, of Luke meeting the disciples and walking through walls and eating fish in their presence is agreed as a minimal fact. But it absolutely isn't. The minimal fact is that there were some events that are reported as appearances, and there was some kind of event that had influence on people. And by accepting minimal facts, we are not in any way accepting that Luke's story is accurate in any way at all.
There's a question I'd like to ask on that then, Ed, because presumably that's true for all of them. So we've got the appearance in the upper room, we've got talking with the two people on the road to Emmaus, I believe it is, and then there's the meeting of the 500, and there's a couple of other appearances. So although we accept that there are reported appearances, what we're not saying is any particular specific one of those appearances is accepted as fact. Where I'm leading to on that is, if all of these specific appearances are deniable, then why are we accepting in any way at all that reported appearances are a minimal fact?
what I think we're doing is accepting 1 Corinthians 15, that creed, as not something Paul made up, but something that he is relaying from the Jerusalem apostles.
Right. Who made this up?
Well, okay.
So I'm being cheeky
now.
Yeah, I'm being cheeky, obviously.
Yeah. The appearance to Peter, I think few people would say Peter didn't have some experience. The appearance to the 11,
So when you say the appearance to Peter, are you talking about the feed my sheep bit?
No, I'm talking that there's a list in 1 Corinthians 15 at the beginning.
I'm wondering if it's worth...
Yeah, this is such a key passage, it might be worth finding it. So I'm going to quickly get there myself. The passage has a kind of top and tail, which speaks of Paul saying this is a tradition he received and isn't just passing on. And it also has this creed, which doesn't include the 500. So don't worry about that. I've now got it in front of me. I'm using the New International Version.
Yeah, but that's the version I've got in front of me. So you're talking about from verse 12?
I'll start with verse 1.
Right.
Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received and which you've taken as found. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. Okay, that's verse 3.
Okay, now see, I read that and my mind immediately says, okay, well, that's hearsay.
Well, okay, so I need to make the argument, because this is an argument that people like James Crossley, who I really like,
right,
a Yorkshireman, which makes him a good start. And he was never a Christian and just got interested in it all, and he's done a lot of work on New Testament stuff. This is the sort of thing he would go with. So that I've topped it, and I'm going to tail it if I can find out. Okay, so he's talking about other apostles in verse 10 and 11, and he said, whether then it is I or they, this is what we preach, and this is what you believed. And the other apostles, I'm pretty certain he's referring to the Jerusalem kind of ex-disciple apostles, people like Peter, and then James, who we'll be talking about more in detail later. That's what he's saying. It is a bit contentious because in his letter to the Galatians, he talks about Jesus said it to me directly, and then he kind of checked it out with the apostles in Jerusalem. But we needn't go there. It's all a bit unclear, and I've never got to the bottom of it. But I'm quite happy to take this passage here at face value, that he has been told and he's passed on to them a key tradition.
Right.
So going back to what I said earlier, verse 3, for what I've received, I've passed on to you of first importance, that Christ died for sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. That has a nice little flow to it.
Yeah.
And then the same flow is repeated, and that he appeared to Cephas, which is Peter.
Yeah.
He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and after that, I am told that this is clearly like a song you said in your episode on it, or a creed. And so this is a snippet of literature that scholars have identified is not typical Paul, either phraseology or whatever. Certainly up to, and then the 12, and then it looks like Paul has put in a thing about the 500. And then after the 500, then he appeared to James and then to all the apostles. And then Paul adds, and last of all, he appeared to me also as one abnormally born.
Right. So you're saying that there's literature that says that this could well be a rhyme in the original?
Certainly has a sort of a structure to it.
It feels like it has a flow.
Repetition.
It feels like you could read it with a certain timbre, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. But you'd have to not take out the 500 bit and then take out the bit at the end, last of all, he appeared to me. But the rest of it has this flow to it.
Okay, so that sounds then like it's also evidence for later editing.
Well, Paul all the way through quotes and quotes. He mostly quotes the Old Testament, but that's just his style. He draws in material to back up what he's saying that his readers will be already familiar with.
Okay, so if we take an approach then that this letter penned by Paul is he pens it and then he makes reference to something that he's bringing to the readers, and then he pens out this rhyme or this creed that he's been taught to say, and he writes that down word for word and then carries on with his letter. So this has been given a specific timbre so that it's easier to memorize.
Yes, that's right. Before Paul got hold of it, according to what Paul is saying.
Yeah.
That kind of puts also fits pretty well with the way oral tradition was carried. Oral tradition often had a sort of element of a bard story to make it easy. And there was still a lot of mouth-to-ear tradition at that time. So I wouldn't think that it would be terribly unusual for something that is a creed or might be made a creed. I don't think it would be terribly unusual for it to have a kind of sing-song quality about it.
No, and it doesn't automatically mean that it's false just because it's presented in that style either.
Yeah, good. I'm glad you got that.
Were you worried about how far I was straying to the mythicist line? Were you?
Just that because it sounded like a song doesn't mean that it's any less important or accurate than other things. I think the early Christians seem to be really keen on their creeds.
Yeah.
Paul quotes creeds vastly more than he quotes Jesus, for example.
Right, okay. But it does, though, mean by necessity that detail is left out because it's simplified in order to fit into that structure. You can't fit a whole story with minute detail into this kind of structure. It has to be by necessity very high level and very abridged.
Yeah.
Which then leaves scope for when people try to expand the detail later, for that's when the myths start creeping in.
Yes, that's right. Could be. I have no idea. I don't think anyone really knows for sure about these things. How much someone like Mark writing in Rome might have actually tapped into stories that were generated by the community based on a creed being expanded in the way that you say. Who knows?
Yeah.
But this is what we've got. This is a letter of Paul that is completely uncontested. So we're on pretty solid ground. People say this is within 2 or 3 years of the crucifixion. I think are overextending it, but it's certainly much earlier than when Paul visited Corinth. We can say this went back to as a creed used in the church.
I want to push back slightly on the idea of being on solid ground here. I don't doubt that it's creed. That's not the solid ground. But I do think that wherever we find a creed, and there's some notion like, God, this Jesus appeared to Peter, and then he appeared to those 12 people over there, all the ex-disciples who were apostles, etc., and last of all to me. One of the things that we don't have is independent accounts from 12 apostles. The New Testament, the bulk of it's written by actually remarkably few people. It is not the case that anywhere near all 12 apostles make individual appearances in terms of their own writing. I made this point in the Knight and Rose show about the 500. Right?
Yes, I agree with you on all of that.
Okay, all right. Well, then I'm not going to belabor the point. It'll just make this carry on for no apparent reason. While I agree that we're on solid ground to think that this is a creed, I don't think we're on solid ground to think that the creed actually bears out some set of facts that should be taken more seriously than we have already.
Okay.
Words,
I do need to clarify what I mean by solid ground.
No, well, I wasn't picking on you, just me pushing back a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I'm making the claim this is solid ground, so I need to explain what I mean.
Oh, sure.
And what I mean is that this is a very good window on the thoughts and beliefs of the early church, very early church.
Yeah, certainly that is the case.
Yeah.
And so I agree.
We know what they thought. So it seems that resurrection belief is incredibly early. And it seems that resurrection belief is based on appearances. Yeah. Are you happy with those two?
Yes.
This one is particularly different for me. And you might just say, and you might be right, Andrew, you surpassed skepticism and into cynicism. But I don't think I am. While I think that there were individuals who were convinced that they had seen Jesus, I don't see any reason to credit those claims, this sort of experience that they say they had, with actually having seen Jesus. Now, why would I say so? Well, I have friends who think that they have been captured by aliens multiple times. I mean, I actually have friends who tell this story at dinner parties. I have known Muslim friends in the past who think that they have had supernatural experiences, not necessarily being visited by Allah, mind you, but supernatural experiences. And so, Ed, my only point is this. If I go down the road of crediting this with an actual appearance of Jesus, that's actually what's backing it, then I see no reason that I wouldn't have to be equally epistemologically committed to acceptance that I had friends who were actually captured by aliens, etc. Do you see what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm not saying that Jesus appeared to people, just that's what the belief that Jesus had appeared to people was what was driving it. Okay, and that would imply that some people believed that Jesus had appeared to them individually and were telling others about it. That's how I see it.
Yeah, fair enough.
I've got a friend who tragically his wife died of cancer, I suppose, most of 10 years ago now. She kind of came to him, held his hands, and he found it a really meaningful experience. But I would have thought no, I wouldn't. I've never pressed him on it to know. In fact, I've kept so far apart. He hasn't told me this directly. He told my wife and she told me about this experience. So that's the kind of thing that happens a lot.
And they're such tender stories, right? So these friends that tell me they have been taken by aliens, they're very serious. These aren't the kind aliens that take you and show you the cosmos and introduce you to their ET relatives and you have a nice meal and they bring you home. That's not their story. And so the night they first told me about it, we were sitting out on their back patio and there were tears involved in these sequential alien abductions. I mean, and so it's hard, very hard to have friends like that and not see the trauma and then push back like you're saying.
Yeah, that's right.
We have these tender stories, and tender stories create in us emotions where we feel accepting of the person, if not the story. And that can become a kind of fact because no one's pushing back on it. In fact, I've never told this story until just now.
Yeah.
We're on Still Unbelievable. So they tell their story. And that, by the way, was back in 2006. I am only just now speaking about it in 2022. So and I don't know anybody that's ever pressed them on. No, there may well be friends who have said, okay, look, I know this is very traumatic for you, but it doesn't seem reasonable to me. But I didn't do it.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far distracted here, but very personal, very quick anecdote on this. I've never told this story publicly. So congratulations on being the first guys to hear this. But these things do happen. When one of my grandmothers died, 20 years ago, she hadn't even been dead a year. And the phone rang one day and I picked up the phone and I said, hello. And my grandmother's voice came out of the telephone to me and said, hello, Matthew, how are you? And I was speechless. It was insane. It was absolutely crazy. And I thought, and I literally didn't know what to say. People say the blood drained from the body. That was how I felt. I didn't know how to process the experience that I was going through. And Sarah, my wife, was trying to talk because she realized something weird was going on and she was trying to talk to me as well. And then suddenly I came to my senses and Mum would about hello. And the voice said, hello, it's Nanny. And it was Sarah's grandma had rung us. But for some reason, when the phone had rung and I'd heard this voice say, hello, it's Nanny, I heard my dead grandmother's voice. And it was a different voice. But for some reason, my brain messed up completely and utterly misunderstood the voice and completely misunderstood the circumstances and sent me into a mental shock, which took me many seconds to recover from. So these things happen. They happen at completely unexpected moments. And they can make us think, say, and do the most bizarre things.
Yeah. The thing going on here is that when you have a perception of something that's not real, it gets to your brain or circulates in your brain with the same circuitry as events that are real.
Yes.
And so it's very difficult when at the receiving end you get this message that comes from the channel of where real information comes from. It's very difficult to unpick it. Can I quote from the famous Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the American one that's like the Psychiatrist's Bible in America? I assume it's famous. They're talking about hallucinations here, which is something I don't want to drop as quickly as you did in your episode on this. They say hallucination is a sensory perception that has the compelling sense of reality of a true perception, but that occurs without external stimulation. And they also note that it's not just visual, it can be auditory like yours, and or touch. There's a lovely story of a woman who, she was working and her cat rolled up against her leg, and she thought, oh, that's lovely. And then she realised, not that the cat had died the previous week and was coming back, that the cat was in a cattery because she was having to work on the house or something. But just that thing, that something gave her this strong perception of her cat stroking her leg in the way they do when it was just wasn't there.
There's documented phenomenon that people think mobile phones vibrate in their pocket when there isn't one in their pocket.
Yeah.
It's these things are very well documented.
Yeah.
Ed, was that quote from the DSM-4 or the DSM-5? Do you happen to know?
I would have picked it up in about 2016 or something.
Yeah, so that's probably the DSM-5.
Now I want to talk about Tara. So she is an old friend.
DSM.
She's an old friend of ours in that she was a regular contributor to the discussions under the Unbelievable show when it was put online by Justin on the Christian Premier Radio.
Yeah.
So we had a lot of fun and maybe some frustration in interacting with Tara, whose views are not that close to ours. But she worked in an old people's home, and she was saying in response to I think the Gary Habermas resurrection show, how she is so used to her patients being visited by people who don't exist, who presumably like loved ones who've died. So she said on this discussion, I've had 2 new patients just this week. They've told me about their visiting spouses. And she said, by the way, no one yet has talked about them as appearing ghostly. And I've heard dozens of accounts. Instead, they describe them as seeming very lifelike, as if the spouse is there in complete physicality. So, I mean, she's not a psychologist, I don't think, maybe wouldn't say hallucination, but she's saying these are the experiences people have. Maybe we should use hallucination as a fairly loose word. We can't diagnose an individual who we know almost nothing about from 2,000 years ago based on a creed about them. So it's a plausible event. Someone like Peter could have experienced a very compelling experience that could easily categorize as a hallucination. I think when Bart Ehrman wrote about it in one of his books, he said how hallucinations, obviously based on his research, are associated with dead spouses a lot and other, close people, and also religious figures, so that, if there was closeness between the disciples and Jesus and they were very familiar, living together for 3 years or whatever it was, that's not an unusual thing to imagine could have happened after Jesus died.
Right. Yeah. Now, we didn't spend a lot of time on the hallucination aspect when we discussed it. I give the hallucination idea quite short thrift because I think it's very hard to establish at all, given the amount of time that's passed. It's as hard to establish as it is to establish fact. So I think suggesting that it's hallucination is as meaningful as suggesting that it happened literally, because for me, I can't separate the two in terms of reading the documents and trying to work out what happened in the past. So for me, it's far, far more likely that the accounts are doctored in one way or another, either people talking about it over periods of time and the story got embellished before it got written down, or after the fact that it was written down, people edited it and embellished it after the original writing down. One or the other is far more likely to me. So I spend so little time thinking seriously about the hallucination because I think it's far, far too difficult to establish with any reliability.
I agree with that last point. I don't think when skeptics talk about hallucinations, they are saying this is what happened.
Right.
And here's the evidence for it. They're responding to the apologist who is saying, how do you explain this, Mr. Skeptic?
Yeah.
And this is going on to something that you said later on that maybe we could jump to and then come back into my flow.
Right.
So in Night and Rose, they were saying, the skeptic is just reduced to saying something happened.
Yeah.
And I think someone who is countering their arguments needs to do more than just say, something happened. I think when scholars like James Crossley would say something happened and leave it there, because it's not scholarship, as you say, it's just speculation.
Yeah.
Scholars can't say, oh, that was hallucinations or this or that. They have to be proper scholars and just say things for which they can find evidence for.
Mm.
Right. And there is I don't really like to play this card in a conversation, but I do think when we're having a somewhat academic discussion about claims, it is reasonable to point out that there is a noticeable and wrong-headed shifting of the burden of proof to just say, well, all the skeptics can say is, because the claim itself must stand on its own, regardless of whether I believe it or not, or whatever I might say against claim. And there's an extraordinarily, or at least in my view should be, pretty extraordinarily high bar of evidence for this kind of claim, because the claim itself is so far outside the ordinary. And Ed, I think you said something about this in your write-up that you sent to us, in sort of the pre-game show. This kind of resurrection claim is very outside the norm. We don't see resurrections on a regular basis. And we don't likewise see appearances of Jesus to people on a regular basis, except maybe on a piece of toast, right? But my point is not to be satirical at all. My point is to say that in the Knight and Roche, whether deliberately or not, they managed to quite adroitly shift the burden through ad hominem attack against the skeptics so that the evidence didn't have to stand to merit the claim.
Okay, I still think, tactically in our response, when they say, oh, well, you're saying something happened and it all sounds a bit lame, that's because you're in trouble. We come back and say, no, there's a perfectly plausible set of events that we can outline that would explain all of the data that it's reasonable to accept as things that did happen.
And hallucination is a plausible explanation.
Yes.
Regardless of how I might think about it personally,
yeah.
It still has a plausibility factor. And
yes.
The other point is, and I think one of your podcast co-hosts has made this point, the hallucination is more plausible than the actual resurrection.
Oh, easily. They're pretty common events.
Yeah.
So just as a question for the two of you, isn't that sort of what we're doing when we say something like, okay, fine, but a claim of experience of seeing Jesus isn't itself evidence for the fact that Jesus was seen? Aren't we as skeptics when we challenge the notion on those grounds? In what way do you think that sort of question is deficient?
Okay, so I think this is the nub of where we're not agreeing. We can't just say there's nothing to see there, move along. In Judaism, there have been loads of Messiah figures, and John the Baptist would be another one. And yet, a religion that's dominated the world has only come from one of them. And the evidence seems to suggest that the resurrection belief is what kept the religion going after, or the movement, I should say, going after the leader of the movement had been executed.
Mm-hmm.
Evidence seems to suggest that belief in appearances is what generated the resurrection belief.
So I agree with all of it.
Okay, so we've got something that we need to explain. If somebody in church says they saw Jesus, we just roll our eyes, and it wouldn't be particularly influential on other people. But a leader who has been crucified, which is a kind of, in Judaism, is a disgraceful, shameful way to a Messiah to come to an end, for them to be suddenly to say, oh, I saw them, he's still alive, in weeks or months or days or whatever after the crucifixion, that is something that's remarkable and has to be remarkable to influence other people and get this whole religion started.
I see. So I think we may have at least found the fulcrum of the disagreement here. We may have found the pivot point, because I actually still think that while there is something to be explained, I think that they are the ones that still have to explain it. So,
well, no, they're saying I explain it by God stepping in and resurrecting Jesus. What's your explanation?
Well,
and if we say, well, something happened, move along, they'll say, gotcha.
No,
And then
no,
all the people who are wanting to believe what they want to believe will say, well done, apologies, you've got him there.
right, but that's not the idea I'm defending. I think what we are doing as skeptics, by and large, is saying, okay, you say that you've seen this Jesus and that's how the whole thing got started and all of that sort of thing. But it's an extraordinary claim. If I said to you today, I saw my dead grandfather, and he's actually the one that influenced my career choice in my life, you wouldn't have to question whether some experience I had did in fact influence my career choice. Surely the claim that I saw my dead father wouldn't be convincing to you. And you would require evidence equal to that claim if I wanted you to believe that I saw my dead grandfather. And so that's where I'm pushing back. Not that there's something that has to be explained, but who has the requirement to do the explaining?
I don't know if it helps to have near-death experiences as a parallel here. You have people who, maybe were evil bankers or something, and they have a near-death experience, and then they become much more rounded people who are more community-minded and maybe even change their career, which is why I thought of that. You wouldn't say, oh, you're just making up this near-death experience, nothing happened. You'd say, yes, there's clearly evidence that from the way their behaviour changed, that they had a really real and compelling experience.
That is what I would say. I would absolutely agree that they had an experience.
Yeah. So that's all I'm saying. I'm taking on board that the disciples had a experience that they really meant something to them and was very real to them.
To which I wholeheartedly agree. There's no disagreement on the table, I think, between any of us over that. The question, and I think the place that I prefer to push back, is whether the experience of the thing is proof of the thing that it claims.
No, I don't think anyone around this podcast is saying that.
Right, but so that's why I'm saying the skeptical community is not the one that has an explanation to put forth. The burden of proof about the miraculous event itself, that there could have been a Jesus that they actually did see. The burden of proof is not on the skeptic to explain how there wasn't some miraculous event. The burden of the miraculous event is actually on the Christians. They have to explain the cause and effect mechanism, or whatever mechanism you think might be there. If there is a miraculous event to be had, the people claiming the miraculous event must surely bear the burden of the evidence to equal the claim.
Yes. Well, there's several ways of pushing back on this, and that's a completely valid one. If you add to it how, well, we've got this simple explanation that's quite plausible, that just takes the wind out of their sails, rather than make them smugly go away and say, oh, the skeptic can only say something happened and feel they've got to win.
Right. So that was actually sort of my point here, that Knight and Rose had subtly shifted burden to the skeptic to say that we must, because they have made a miraculous claim. The burden is somehow on the skeptical community to prove that it wasn't miraculous.
Yeah.
And that seems to me to be the wrong way around.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not trying to make an issue of it. It's just, the way I prefer to go about this particular idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's partly why I'm not a big fan of suggesting that there was hallucination, because the Christian can scoff at the hallucination for the same reasons that I alluded to earlier and go, well, that's not good enough. It's far more, I'm just going to stick with believing there was a real resurrection, thank you, and walk away. And that gets to what Andrew was saying. We haven't given them a reason to adequately doubt their explanation. They've just laughed at the hallucination because it's so improbable in their mind that they're sticking with their crucifixion. So I would rather use arguments and tactics to get them to doubt and question their proposition than give them reason to doubt mine, because I don't know what happened. I've never pretended to know what happened, but the Christian does think that they know what happened. So I want them to defend that point, and I want them to listen to my challenge to their point. And as soon as we get into the subject of me talking about what might have happened, whether it's a hallucination or whether it's a later edit, we've taken the focus off the resurrection. And I want the focus to be on the resurrection, because that can't have happened. Okay.
Yeah. There's a sort of point here that we've just vaguely mentioned, which I'll go talk through and then go back to hallucinations.
Right.
I haven't finished on that.
Okay.
The objection, they said that the skeptic is only left with this objection that it's a miracle. That it's not, or the reason for resisting it, because if we as skeptics are so against the miraculous that there's no way that we are going to bow to this amazing evidence that they think they're providing.
We're coming with an anti-miracle bias, so therefore we can't accept it. So we're being unreasonable.
Yes, and they said that's all there. That's the only problem, they're saying. Yeah. And you covered it, but I would like to add something to that, and that is really they've got a choice, and neither side of the choice is going to work for them. They could either say, well, resurrections happen all the time. They're kind of part of life. In which case, if Jesus did rise from the dead, then there's nothing there to suggest that Jesus is anything special compared to anyone else. Or they say resurrections are so unlikely, so rare, such a special event that Jesus resurrecting indicates how special he was, and it's the foundation of our religion. And Hume talks about religion being founded on a miracle. Well, he's talking about Christianity. People are Christians and not Muslims because they believe the resurrection proves that their Messiah rose from the dead and is the Son of God and all the rest of it. If you're using the resurrection as the foundation for all of that, it's got to bear a lot of weight. So it's got to be an exceedingly unlikely event that you then show happened for us to have the shock and awe that, oh yeah, okay, so Jesus was really special after all. So okay, Jesus it is an exceedingly unlikely event, in which case all the skeptics' arguments saying so much more likely there's normal human frailties, biases, exaggerations, all the stuff that we've been talking, you were talking about in the episode on this, that kicks in as the much more likely explanation.
When I get on an airplane, I don't have an anti-airplane crashing bias. I'm just aware that they don't crash more often than they have successful takeoffs and landings. And likewise, I don't have an anti-miracle bias. It's just that the natural world, I've not seen a miracle. And it's still unbelievable. The thing that we press is show us how this thing works. Show us a miracle. We'll change our name to unbelievable. We can be done with this pretty quickly.
You mean so believable?
Yes.
So believable. Yeah, awesome.
Nicely done. That's very nicely turned. But I don't. Now, maybe there are skeptics who have anti-miracle biases. I'm not one. I've let people try to heal me even recently. By the way, listeners, no change. I'm still unhealed. I think it is fair to say that there are skeptics with an anti-miracle bias, but hopefully we're not those skeptics. Though I must honestly confess, I have no idea.
No, I've got anti-miracle bias.
What's that?
I have an anti-miracle bias, but that's not what the reason for rejecting the resurrection. Okay, it's just not well evidenced. But to me, I've thought through my worldview with a lot of anguish and thinking and a lot of reading and everything. And my worldview now is naturalism, which is a rejection of anything miraculous or spirits or ghosts or gods or God or whatever. And I hold
just
it.
To clarify
I might be wrong,
that, though,
but that's what I hold. And so I would need something major to push me out of that worldview, and a miracle would.
And I'm exactly the same as that, Ed. And just to clarify to any Christian theist, whoever who might hear this and misunderstand what it is you're trying to say, you're not saying it's impossible for you to believe in miracles. You're saying, given the evidence that you've been presented with, you don't think miracles are possible, but that could change with the right evidence.
Yes, that's right.
And I'm exactly the same. So the critical bit there is, let's have the right evidence.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm a practical materialist myself, or naturalist, depending on which philosophy papers and articles you're reading. And part of that worldview is repeatability. So I have a hard time taking any singular event and drawing conclusions from it. That's not to say that there can't be singular events from which we can draw conclusions. But I think as a materialist myself, we have to hold singular events and the conclusions we draw from them very carefully. We have to hold them quite lightly. And so repeatability, as I've said over and over, that's a key element in drawing any sort of rational conclusion.
Yeah.
That said, I think the religious folks I can't believe I'm going to say this. Matthew, you're probably going to have to cut this. No, I'm going to go ahead. I don't know what the extent of the natural world is. And I did say I don't know what it would take to convince me of a miracle. I have no idea. And I have said in the past that you could probably convince me of a miracle for bad reasons. But if we're going to be epistemologically and ontologically honest, then if there was some repeatable, demonstrable way to reproduce a miracle, well, then that would have to somehow become a part of the worldview. My problem with miracles is if there's ever been a miracle, and I honestly do not believe there has been, we don't have a cause and effect mechanism for anything so far that has had a miracle claim. And without some sort of a cause and effect mechanism, if you've got a singular event or something unusual that has happened, there's no way to rule a miracle in. An unexplained event is just that, unexplained. And you can't import miracle into the unexplained.
Good. I'm going to carry on with my hallucination stuff. See that through. Hallucinations are individual things. You mentioned in the episode about an alpha member or alpha male, I forget the exact term, influencing others. And that's exactly how I see it. It was you, Andrew, that mentioned this. And so if we have someone like Peter, who's actually mentioned first off in the Creed thing and in some of the Gospels as well, actually, as having a visitation or appearance by Jesus, and he is completely convinced that Jesus is raised, he will then be very influential on the other members of the group, but of his position and presumably his character and all the rest of it. And that, to me, is something sufficient just to get things going. Other people start having hope and believing, and this whole psychological, I'm trying to think of the word, it's not triggering, it's where belief in one person makes other people much more likely to believe it as well. People did a trick on Loch Ness for the Loch Ness Monster. By having a boat making some waves and then somebody getting very excited and said, yes, I saw Nessie. You get other people around believing that they saw Nessie too and reporting it. And that was like a kind of staged almost experiment to demonstrate this triggering effect of belief in one person generating belief in another. There was another one where a magician with bending a key in front of people, by one person being convinced, other people could be convinced much more easily. So this is what goes on. Another point you made, Andrew, actually, was that apologists love to do it when you say, OK, we've got our minimal facts. What are the explanations? And they go down the list and, hallucinations, that's an explanation that skeptics like. And then they say, well, OK, how about the appearance to the 11 or whatever? How do you explain that with an hallucination? And how come all these people are having hallucinations together? That's ridiculous. But no, that's just one hallucination is quite sufficient to get the belief started. And then a different kind of experience is what's behind these group appearances. Or, it's not difficult for us to imagine a very religiously charged meeting and people saying, oh, yes, Jesus was there and he appeared to us. Something that actually was quite mundane could be behind some of these traditions, and then Jesus appeared to the 11, which then decades later became Jesus walking through the walls and eating fish in front of them.
Ed, on this topic, you're a person I trust. I've known Matthew for quite a while now. He is someone
you don't trust.
And okay, you just knocked me right out.
I am a Windows user, so he does have his limits.
So you are two people that I have come to trust. I have no idea when it will happen because I won't even think about it when it does. But in the future, sooner rather than later, you two, one of you will have said something to me. And I will repeat it to someone else as fact without attribution. And even if you're wrong about it, this is something you said a little while ago. We don't have a filter for true and false. All the experiences that we have come through the same circuitry. And so you are two people that I trust. And I will inevitably repeat things that you say to me as if they are fact, even if you tell me something that is wrong. And I don't know that the resurrection bit the multiple appearance needs more explanation than that. Because I think we do it all the time. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I am aware that it does happen that people make claims, and we do go about the idea of accepting the burden of proof for ourselves to deconstruct the claim. So I do know that happens. It happens in the scientific world all the time. Right around the Bicep 2 period, there was a claim that they had seen neutrinos traveling faster than the speed of light, and a bunch of scientists signed on to the fact that these neutrinos actually slightly broke the speed of light. And some other scientists who thought that simply wasn't the case took it on themselves to deconstruct that idea. And in fact, of course, it turned out to be what it has always turned out to be so far, and that is a slight equipment miscalibration, right?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah,
I do too.
And I'm sorry that I can't talk more intelligently about the details than that, but I did want to give back some ground because I do think that you're right. Given a certain kind of claim that we feel attached to, or that we think, is wrong-headed somehow, we may have a quite strong attachment to that kind of claim and set out to accept the burden of proof and create a counter-explanation. So on further reflection, just while we've been sitting here talking, I think I should give at least half that ground back.
Okay, so I think I'm happy now to finish on this idea of how do we explain these appearances, but I've got a little bit more when we come on to Paul, which we can do now. You were a bit skeptical of Paul's claim to have been a persecutor of the church.
Yes, we did express a little bit of suspicion of how bad he really was. This was under the banner of, actually, no, it was a little bit of that, but there was a bigger context to that. This was where they were saying about enemy attestation.
Yes,
and
right.
they put Paul's testimony under the category of enemy attestation. And our point was, when Paul gave his attestation, he wasn't an enemy. Paul's testimony was he used to be an enemy and now he's not, and he's attesting. And they were saying Paul's attestation is enemy attestation. So yeah. It was all part of that objection.
Yeah, I think scholars will really take it on board that when Paul writes his letters, he is an eyewitness to himself. So he isn't telling stories, he's talking about himself. And okay, I get it that you're used to people who convert to Christians over-egging their pre-Christian evilness.
Yeah.
Paul does say in his own words that he persecuted the church. He says it in a letter, and this letter to me is probably the most secure letter of all of them because it is full of dirty laundry about his spats with Peter and that kind of thing. So the church is unlikely to have invented this as a letter of Paul. It's got all this sort of, I suppose you could almost say it's the criteria of embarrassment. We'll get onto that later. Scholars of all kinds are very pleased to say, we've got Galatians, and that tells us what Paul really thinks. He could be over-egging things, but that's the level of where the errors are going to come in. It's not people making up stuff about Paul and putting it into his mouth. The joy of it is that in Galatians 1, we have Paul telling us about his Damascus Road experience. So this is the conversion. What Paul said was he was advancing in Judaism and all this, that, and the other, and very zealous. And blah, blah, blah. Paul's words, when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased, this is the key phrase, to reveal his son in me so that I might preach among the Gentiles. Then my immediate response was not to consult anyone. Then he went off to Damascus. He went to Jerusalem, then returned to Damascus, all the rest of it. So this is his Damascus Road experience that is written up in Acts as Jesus appearing and other people fell over, and there's a sort of confusion as to whether it was the voice was heard or the voice wasn't heard by other people. I don't know if you remember all this kind of debate over whether there's conflicts or not in the various stories in Acts about this. But we here have Paul's own words, and he said, God was pleased to reveal his son in me. So this is an internal experience, as far as we know. That the word isn't completely clear, but we can certainly interpret it as Paul is admitting that it's an internal experience he has.
Yeah.
And this Damascus Road experience is what it's talking about here, is what he seems to be referring to in that key passage in 1 Corinthians 15 that we dug into a bit earlier on.
Okay, yeah.
So Paul is saying, I had my experience of Jesus appearing to me, and he's using exactly the same Greek word, he appeared to me also, as the word used in the creed for Jesus appearing to Cephas and to the 12 and to the 500 and to James and to all the apostles. So there is good reason to think that these are internal experiences. I'd add to it that when it's written up in Acts, it's mentioned 3 times, the event, and then Paul talking about it to people, that in one of them, Paul is talking to a Roman governor, I think. He says, I was not disobedient to the heavenly vision. So that isn't Paul's words. That's words that Paul has supposedly said to a Roman authority in the book of Acts. So it's not as authoritative as Paul's words in Galatians in terms of what Paul really thought. But still, it's, a tradition in the church about what Paul thought of this experience he had. And he called it a heavenly vision, which to me is also an internal experience. So there is good evidence to think that these experiences, that the church was happy that they could well have been internal experiences from their point of view. And maybe it's a modern category anyway, whether it's an internal experience or kind of Jesus objectively appearing to people. Maybe
so it could be a vision rather than an experience that they could see with
yes,
eyes.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Now I think Knight and Rose pushed back against this. It certainly is used to push back against it. I'm not sure how muddled they were in the way they explained it, but there is this pushback against it, which is that the Jewish view of resurrection was of a very physical one. I think N.T. Wright has said it as well, that the idea that a ghostly experience could be seen as interpreted as a resurrection is not on. So against that, I've got that these hallucinations aren't like ghostly experiences, and even Tara herself said the very words that, and the diagnostic manual seems to push against it as well. So there's that. And there's also this, in the rest of 1 Corinthians 15, this whole discussion about Jesus having a spiritual body instead of a natural body in his resurrection. And so it looks to me like Paul is trying to walk a tightrope between the church knowing that Jesus appeared to people in a spiritual way, and yet still this Jewish doctrine or idea that resurrection was physical had to be squashed together. And he solves it by Jesus having a body, but it's a spiritual body, not a natural body.
I don't understand what is meant by a spiritual body.
Well, that's the point. It's so muddled and we don't know what's going on that's ringing bells for us.
Yeah.
But he does, in the end, he admits towards the end of 1 Corinthians 15 that he's talking about the risen Jesus being a life-giving spirit. That's verse 45. So it's almost like he's admitting it for us, that Jesus, as he appeared to people, it was as this more of a spiritual thing rather than as physically eating fish with them, which to me doesn't make sense anyway. It's all very odd. Because you've got Lazarus, who, according to the narrative, he died, and 4 days later, Jesus raised him from the dead, and then he carried on living, and he was a bit of a thorn in the flesh of the authorities because he carried on living and was saying, yes, Jesus raised me from the dead. And that is fully physical, according to that narrative. And yet Jesus' one wasn't. According to the narrative, he mysteriously appears through walls and then disappears again. Or he appears in Matthew 28, he appears to the disciples and some of them doubted. It's in and out appearances. It's not just Jesus living with them.
Ed, just a couple of chapters before 1 Corinthians 15. So I'm pretty sure that this is in 1 Corinthians 12 when Paul is talking about spiritual gifts. So we get more spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians 13. There's a passage, I think it's 1 Corinthians 12, where we get the notion that young men will see visions and old men will dream dreams. And now that you've said what you've said about this notion being pretty muddled and Paul seeming to make a sort of admission that this is a spiritual body and all that sort of thing, there was a sort of ontology at work at the time that seemed to make people, if you claimed this kind of thing, I had a vision, or, I dreamed a dream or whatever, that was somehow you're a more godly person if you have that sort of experience or make that kind of claim. And today, that sort of thing seems to still be at work. People that speak in tongues are quite often very highly regarded. I'm just taking a long way of agreeing that this is quite muddled. It was also very widely accepted at the time. You were highly thought of if you were given this gift of seeing a vision or dreaming a dream?
Yeah. It's interesting that dreams and visions are put together. But a dream is clearly in your head. No one disputes that. There's
Right.
no physical reality that you're seeing or external reality you're seeing when you have your dream. It's sort of, it all happens within you.
Right. Whereas visions, on the other hand, are like so now that we're talking about this, I wonder from a psychological perspective, what would actually separate a vision seen in the New Testament from a hallucination? What could a person claim about a legitimate vision that couldn't be said of a hallucination? Could you ever distinguish between the two?
Yes, I think the empty tomb would. I love the story of the snowman with those cartoons with Raymond Briggs, I think, and it's a sort of famous Christmas cartoon that lasts about
Frosty,
10 minutes with Walking in the Air, that lovely song. Are you familiar with it?
I know Frosty the Snowman, but I'm not sure.
No, okay, it's different from that. Okay, it's a beautiful cartoon that's all part of Christmas now in Britain. Boy makes a snowman. The snowman comes to life in the middle of the night on Christmas Eve, and they have all these beautiful adventures together and go off to the North Pole eventually in fantastic drawing and singing. And then they dance around and they meet Santa, and he's given us a beautiful scarf. Then they all come back and everything. And then he wakes up in the morning and it's thawed a bit and the snowman's barely there. It's all very sad. And he thinks, oh, the whole thing was just a dream. But then he sees he's still holding the scarf in his hand. So the scarf makes it from a dream or a vision, as you could say, into reality.
Mm.
And that's what the empty tomb serves as, if it was real.
Yeah, so I get what you're saying there. I guess the big question would be how to demonstrate that they are actually related to a supernaturally empty tomb. There's all kinds of empty tombs in the world and misidentified markers and all that sort of thing. And so we would still have the further problem of, hey, here's this empty tomb and it's empty supernaturally.
Yeah. Actually, on our podcast, we had someone called Matthew Harkle on. His thesis was that the empty tomb was the trigger. I was saying how, to me, this vision that we could categorize as a hallucination was a trigger that got the whole thing rolling. Well, he thought the empty tomb could have been the thing that got the whole thing rolling. And of course, in that culture, people did nick bodies from tombs. But I found the whole tomb thing a bit implausible.
Me too. Marvelously crafted bit of English understatement. I find the tomb a bit implausible. It's so beautifully done.
Yeah. People tend to accept the tomb and they argue about whether it was empty or not. But I think the whole tomb thing is implausible.
Well, you mean Joseph Arimathea putting Jesus in a special tomb? You mean that?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, I agree, because this guy just turns up, how conveniently, just with a spare tomb that he can put the body in. The whole character of Joseph Arimathea feels like a narrative ploy that's brought in just to put Jesus in a special tomb.
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that he had to be bold, it says in Mark, he boldly went to Pilate. Well, that shows that it's well outside normal practice to take crucified bodies of insurgents and put them in rich people's tombs.
Yeah.
Gentlemen, I have run up against a hard stop for me. Please do not stop on my account because there's more work to be done. Okay, guys, look, thank you both, and we'll talk.
Right. Okay. So let's carry on.
Okay, so we were deep in Paul, I think, and I can round that off.
Yes. And you were making a point about you thought that we were potentially being a little bit unnecessary by doubting or calling into question the validity of Paul's previous life.
Yes, that's right. I take your point that it's not enemy attestation because he's not an enemy when he's the witness describing these events. But I think it's something that needs to be explained how he had this change of heart. But people have change of hearts, you know.
Yes, he does. And when I think back to, cause I haven't read Paul's letters for a very, very long time, and I'm unmotivated to study them in deep detail. And so it's very possible that I'm misremembering. I remember as a young child growing up in missionary school, as in a school for missionary children, they're being taught that Paul was a wicked, horrible person and murdered Christians and looked out to murder Christians. But that's not what I remember reading when I actually got round to reading those letters.
Yeah. he does say it a few times, I think. This one, he says, I intensely persecuted the Church of God and tried to destroy it.
Right. But see, the word persecuted there could cover a multitude of activities, from being unkind on Twitter to stabbing them through the heart in an intentional act to kill them. So there's a whole load of stuff that gets covered by that. And persecuted is a word that's gone through multiple translations. So we don't really know what was actually originally. Well, somebody knows what was originally said because someone's got the Greek somewhere. But as an English only speaker, I don't know what that persecuted comes from, but I could probably find out.
Yeah, I've never looked into that word. Yeah, so I think all we're saying is that it's a minimal fact that Paul was someone who was resisting Christianity and he became a Christian, and that's a fact that people explain by the resurrection, and so it kind of adds weight to their argument. And I hope I've said enough on it all to dissipate that.
I think yes, you have. Just as a slight aside, I think another slightly related point I'd bring up is when you hear people's testimonies, and a classic example of testimony podcast to listen to is the Side B podcast, which has lots of people whose testimony stories I've been told, and it's especially interesting are the adult convert stories. And quite often there are people who self-report that they were obnoxious anti-Christian atheists. And quite often when you get down into the nitty-gritty of what the conversion is about, certainly from the male perspective, quite often when it comes to the conversion point, there's a Christian woman involved at some point in there. There's a love interest. And quite often that crops up as part of the story. And so you do wonder if, as soon as the love interest comes in, that critical thinking and rationality drops slightly somewhat, because the heart is talking, and the heart is talking very loudly here. And while that's not explicitly said in Paul, you do kind of wonder if maybe there were other motivations at play there. Yes, it's not said, and yes, this is pure speculation. But I have this kind of mindset, is there's a pattern here. Somebody self-reports to being bad, something dramatic happens, they've converted, and they're complete. And there is probably something else in there that isn't clear, we're not being told about. Maybe it's a love interest, maybe it's something else, and fits a pattern. And so I feel like I'm justified in calling into question how bad the persecution really was.
Okay, yeah. That reminds me of a conversation I had with a friend on your topic, actually, missionaries. I was saying to him, well, you know, when in missionary circles, the native population become Christians because they get fed, and that's called rice Christians.
Yeah.
I said, well, what is it that when you have someone becoming a Christian because of he wants to get along with a woman who's already a Christian? And my friend got back straight and said, oh yeah, I know what that's called. That's called oats Christians. So we've got rice Christians and oats Christians.
I have never heard that before.
Well, that is a genuine conversation I had with a friend. It's not a joke that I'm telling you.
Oh, you should.
But tell it as a joke from now on, everybody.
That is just brilliant. That has tickled me. Thank you, Ed. It's been worth it just for that. That is just fabulous.
Actually, do you know of David Pawson? Do you remember him?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
The name's vaguely familiar. I might need reminding.
Okay, well, it was his son anyway that I was talking to. Okay, next on the list of these minimal facts is the conversion of James.
Yeah.
I can't remember what your take on it was, but I remember thinking
cover
my
it for
take
very
is
long.
different.
Yeah, I don't think we covered it for very long. I think we're a bit of a so what and moved on, I think. Yeah.
Justin has it in his list, so it is something someone I respect treats as serious. And I think the point is, how do you explain Jesus' brother, James, who the Gospels report having a strong aversion to Jesus and his ministry and saying he's mad and what's going on here? That's in several Gospel stories, particularly Mark 3, he's out of his mind, Jesus' brothers were saying. And yet suddenly there he is as a leading light of the movement after the resurrection. So people join the dots and say, what can explain this? And the only thing that could possibly explain this is the resurrection.
Right.
And so it's further evidence of the resurrection. So I guess I'm happy. Certainly James being a key member of the church and actually being killed. It's one of the few people, when they try this martyr argument, was actually killed associated with religion. It's hard to say if he was martyred for his faith. That's a bit of a stretch from what Josephus tells us. But that's what we've got. Now, well, even Richard Borkman, who's a pretty well-known conservative scholar who does a lot of work on the kind of eyewitness side, and he's borderline towards being an apologist, and he's been on Justin's show quite a lot. He's been on Unbelievable quite a lot, and kind of arguing, say, against Bart Ehrman about how good the Gospels are as reliable sources for us. Anyway, he, in his writing, has doubted that James became a kind of like a believer, a follower of Jesus after the resurrection, or crucifixion, I should say. He thinks it happened before, because he thinks he accompanied Jesus and learned his teaching for at least a significant part of Jesus' ministry. So that's something from a very conservative scholar. I
could probably be more convinced by that line of reasoning, I think, rather than the resurrection converting James.
Yeah. I think this holds very little water, because what we have, the kind of data points we have, are James being a key part of the church after it all, and James being told in Mark, which is the earliest and therefore the most reliable of the Gospels we've got, saying Jesus out of his mind. Now, let's compare this with Mary, the mother of Jesus. She's clearly there. Tradition has it that she's central in the church after the crucifixion, and that she is also in this same group that came to Jesus and said he's out of his mind, take him away, in Mark. So we've got the same two data points for Mary. But nobody ever says of Mary, oh, well, look how she changed it. That must be evidence of the resurrection. And the reason people never say that is because we have another story about Mary being at the cross and very supportive of Jesus and all that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's only argument from silence that there isn't a similar story about James being there at the cross, or being, within the in-group of Jesus before the cross. It's only because there's no story like that people are basing this whole argument.
Yes, one would imagine that James would be there with his mother at the cross, wouldn't you? If his mother was there, would you imagine James would be there?
Well, but the Gospel authors chose to talk about Mary being at the cross. I don't know why James should be there.
Well, supporting the mother, presumably, or the mother saying, I need you there, or whatever, or carrying something.
Well, the whole point of the story was that Jesus hands over his sort of duties of a son to
John. Was it John?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be a reason to omit mentioning James.
Yeah. I'm not saying James was likely to be there at the cross. I'm just, if the other followers of Jesus fled, then why not him as well fleeing?
Yeah.
And maybe it's safer for women to...
If James wasn't there and fled with the disciples, then that presumably would be evidence that James was converted and was a senior person in this movement.
Yeah, but we can't talk about speculation on one hand and then say it's evidence on the other.
Yes, that is true. that is true.
What I'm saying is, to make this argument, you have to argue from silence.
Yeah.
In a way that some arguments from silence work, but only where the absence of something that you would strongly expect to be in the case. But there's no reason to expect any mention of James in the gap between when he's mentioned saying Jesus out of his mind in Mark and appearing as a pillar of the church fairly soon after the resurrection.
But you say pillar of the church, but he's by no means as dominant as Paul has become. Paul is the one that modern Christians look to as being the person who cemented out the doctrines of Christianity.
Well, Paul in Galatians, this letter I'm so keen on, describes going to Jerusalem to check things out with the pillars of the church. That's my phrase, not his. And James and Peter are the two people he names.
Two names, right?
Yeah.
Is it possible it's a different James?
There
or
is confusion over this, but I've never heard that as being a possibility. So there must be something to make it clear that James.
Okay.
I think Galatians itself says that James is the brother of our Lord or something like that.
All right.
I think that's a big thing that people argue about on this to counter Jesus mythicism.
Yeah. See, that's the other thing. Why is the conversion of James really so convincing? I understand what you've said about the conversion and the strength of the belief of James, and if James wasn't convinced that Jesus rose, then he wouldn't have done that. I kind of get that, but I'm still not seeing how important it is in the structure of things, because it still could be something that could be fictionalized. There's literally enough written about James that it could be inserted fiction.
Yes, his previous hostility to Jesus could easily be inserted fiction. But him being a pillar of the church, if you're going to be a historian about these things, obviously nothing is absolutely 100% clear and secure in history. But if you're going to be a historian about it, you say, yes, it's highly likely that James, the brother of Jesus, was a leading leader of the church from fairly early on.
Right. Okay.
So that's the argument, and that's why I don't think it works in this case.
Okay. Now, just to play a little bit more around with this, though, there are people who say that the resurrection of Jesus wasn't actually a physical resurrection anyway. There are Christians who say that. And maybe the church grew out of that knowledge that there was belief in the resurrection, but not a physical bodily resurrection that some people affirm, but a different type of resurrection. Whatever that could be is anybody's guess. And maybe could the religion still have grown from that small seed without an actual physical resurrection the way Christians think of it today?
I think so. And I'm throw in the mix this argument that people make that, well, the Jews believed in a very physical kind of resurrection. And so resurrection belief may be based on this more ethereal kind of resurrection, or raising from the dead, certainly, morphed into a belief in a very physical resurrection.
Right.
And that's why it's only in the latest stories that you have Jesus eating fish in front of people.
Yeah. So these facts could still be true without a physical resurrection. The only thing that lends credence to a physical resurrection is the empty tomb part. Because Paul's experience wasn't a physical experience.
Mike Licona is very honest, I think. And so he went in a debate, he will not use the empty tomb because he doesn't think it's an established minimal fact.
Yeah.
So he will use really the appearances as the key aspect. And he combines it with this argument about Jews only believed in physical resurrection to make the visions into there must have been something physical there.
Right.
I put it the other way around and say, well, if they believed in a resurrection or a raising from the dead that then became a Jewish style resurrection, it had to be physical in their minds, and so that physicality got added to it.
Right. Yeah. To me, that makes more sense. It sounds much more plausible to me. It helps to fit the evolved narrative that we read, with more details being added in later documents.
Yeah. In fact, another thing they say, which I don't think works, is resurrection belief was only for the end of the age. And so it was a very remarkable thing for people to believe that Jesus had been resurrected rather than brought back to life. But it's all very confusing to me. I don't quite get this. But because if you have resurrections in the Old Testament and in the ministry of Jesus, and Jesus himself was raised from the dead. So, and it's all pretty similar language. So yes. If they later did their theology and said this is the end of the age, resurrection, come forward, well, good luck to them. I don't think it's evidence of anything.
No. Calling
it, someone raised from the dead, then becoming, this is resurrection as this concept of the end of the age, then it's just, ideas developing.
Mm.
There's no evidence there for anything. I think I've done all of the minimal facts that are minimal facts that we have talked about and you've talked about, but we haven't done the empty tomb, except to say it's definitely not a minimal facts. And this is where this criteria of embarrassment comes in.
Okay. Yes, we spent a bit of time talking around that. I seem to remember.
And that actually is something that did slightly wind me up the way you talked about it, because it is a thing in New Testament scholarship that is talked about by non-conservative scholars.
Right.
And Mark Goodacre is a perfect example. So he studied at Oxford. He's probably a Christian, but he's definitely not an apologist and a conservative. He's just interested in the evidence, and Christian origins is the kind of thing he would talk about. And he is aware of and teaches on in his lectures the criteria, and the criteria of embarrassment is one of the standard criteria. And he does a lovely little 12-minute talk on it in his podcast called NT Pod, which I strongly recommend.
Okay. I'll see if I can find that and stick it in the show notes then. So check out the show notes, listeners, for things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, lovely. And he is skeptical of the criteria of embarrassment for various reasons, but he doesn't completely dismiss it. He says it's sort of troubling and we've moved on from it a bit. But he's not just completely dismissing it as hogwash. He's great to listen to, and I strongly recommend, if people want to know more about these criteria, to listen to all of his little 10, 12-minute slots on the various criteria and all the other stuff he does.
Right. And I think one of the points that we were making in our episode was when you do try to investigate criterion of embarrassment as a historical process, you are overwhelmed with examples of apologists using it to try to prove the minimal facts of the resurrection. That seems to be its niche. There's very little use of something that could come under that banner outside of that extremely narrow context, and certainly outside of New Testament historicity, it's vanishingly small. And I think I only found one or two examples of it, and it took a lot of hard work to find an example of it. And the best example I found, one that was on the Paulo Gia podcasts and YouTube channel, which I believe is a link to it on episode 80 in the show notes there. So it was very, very hard to find anything that was not related at all to the New Testament. Yeah. So Mark doesn't make that point, but he does make other points of why he thinks it's a bit weird. Right. Basically, if you're embarrassed by something, why would you write about it? Yeah. You've got so much material to write about with Gospels and things. So if you're embarrassed, then you leave it out. And just because it's true doesn't mean you put it in. Yes. And which I can't remember if I actually said this on our episode. It does, for me, it fits a standard storytelling narrative arc. You've got your hero having a great life. They have a dip, a tragedy, and then they overcome their tragedy and it turns into triumph. And that's your standard storytelling arc. You can see it in Top Gun. You can see it in Days of Thunder. You can see it in many other very, very big movies, high grossing movies. And so the existence of something like that, for me, isn't actually confirming of its facts. It's, for me, it's confirming of its dramatic storyline narrative arc. Yeah. Well, I think the classic one that Mark said was an example of criteria of embarrassment is Jesus being baptized by John. Right. If Jesus is this great overall Messiah who's more important than John and everything, you wouldn't want to have him being baptized by John. Interesting. John the Baptist. See, I would never have thought that moment would be a criterion of embarrassment moment. It just doesn't feature for me. It was always sold to me as Jesus did it because he wasn't ready to start his ministry, because he hadn't really started his ministry at that point, had he? Or at least it was early days. So this was about kickstarting his ministry. Yeah. And so it was a jump start rather than an embarrassment. So I'm a bit puzzled to find it come under the banner of embarrassment. Yeah. Well, so maybe it's not a very good criterion. Basically, it wasn't embarrassing enough for Mark, the gospel writer, to leave it out. So there you go. Yeah. Yes. So this all becomes relevant with the key argument that people use for the empty tomb, which is that women are the witnesses. Yeah. And this just fails on so many levels. It does. I think so too. So there's the one you mentioned, which is, well, if you're going to talk about a story of an empty tomb, you would have to have women discovering it first, because they're the kind of people who go to tombs to do things. Yeah. It's a sort of women's thing. Yeah. So that's great. That's a good one. The one I like is that Mark seems to be almost enjoying the embarrassment. He couldn't lay it on thick enough, because what he's done is taking the whole story. The witnesses of Jesus' ministry are the disciples, and they're increasingly described as stupid and dim and cowardly and all the rest of it. They have a terrible press in Mark, implausibly so. It's ridiculous, the kind of things that they don't understand. And they completely bog up and flee just before the crucifixion. And then the witnesses come in, these new set of witnesses come in from nowhere, and that's the women. And they witness Jesus's crucifixion.
and they witness his burial sort of from afar, and then they witness the empty tomb. And then the women bog up completely because of Mark says very clearly that they fled and told no one. And so Mark absolutely relishes the idea that there isn't good attestation of the empty tomb. Not only is it women, it's also they don't tell anybody. So these are the worst witnesses you could possibly have.
Yes, quite. And how did he know they saw it if they didn't tell anybody?
Well, this is my theory. I think I've read it in scholarship, but it's not a strongly held one. But I think it works. And that is that Mark knows that he's actually putting it on a stretch here and telling people something that they haven't heard before when he describes the empty tomb. Because Mark is our very first witness of the empty tomb. Nobody before him has mentioned it in Christian literature that we're aware of. And then the other gospel writers pick up on it, and then the church farmers and all the rest of it. So Mark is our very first voice about the empty tomb. And so he could be saying, I know you've never heard of this story of the empty tomb, but here it is. It happened, and this is why it's only come out now that the women eventually have told their story. And then Mark's gospel ends with the women fleeing, not telling anybody. And when all the other three of the gospels have men witnessing the empty tomb. So they correct what Mark has done by adding men, and they also, of course, adjust it so the women do tell people. What Mark's aim seems to be rejected and overwritten by the other gospel writers. And you do have men attesting the empty tomb. So what's the problem? There's no embarrassment here. When it's the other three gospels, you have a story of women, as you'd expect, as you said, Matt, women being the ones to find the empty tomb. And then very quickly, you've got men checking on the women. And yes, men confirm the empty tomb. There's guards in Matthew, and then the disciples in Luke and in John. So there you go.
Right. And then one of them has an angel with a flaming sword or something guarding the tomb, doesn't they?
This is the Gospel of Peter.
Right.
Which is 2nd century and tremendous fun. We don't have much of it, but we do have the empty tomb story.
Right.
Jesus walks out of the tomb like a massive cross. which Mark Goodacre's got into, and he thinks it's a copying mistake, and it means crucified one. The crucified one comes out. Because it is ridiculous. And my favourite bit is that the kind of people of Jerusalem come out with their deck chairs and set them out ready to see the scene because they know it's going to happen.
You see, and as soon as you start including those other, even later, more embellished stories, you start to see much more clearly the growth of this story. As soon as they start cutting it off when it starts becoming too much to believe, then you're managing to fool the modern population into believing something that's a myth.
Yeah.
But there is something else that bothers me about this whole finding the tomb story, and this is something that I didn't bring up in our conversation in episode 83, and that is the layout of the tomb. Now, I was always taught that the tomb had quite a large entrance that you could walk into, and that the stone had to be rolled over to cover the entrance. And it was a massive stone, like a huge wheel, which was on a slope in a groove, and it's uphill from the hole. And then you let it roll down so it blocks over the tomb, and you chock it so it can't be rolled away. But if you take that chock out, it continues rolling down the hill. So how do you then get this massive stone back up the hill to reseal the tomb? So there's so much about the practicalities of how this could possibly work that makes so little sense for me, because two women can't turn up at this tomb, take off this chock, this massive stone, roll off downhill. They go and do what they need to do to the body with the anointing, etc. Come back. How are they going to get the stone back? If multiple men can't do it, two women aren't going to be able to do it. So there's whole practicalities about how this could possibly work in finding the empty tomb. Just leaves me scratching my head thinking, who could possibly think that this could work?
I've heard it said that the description of the tomb fits much better with late 1st century tombs than tombs that were early 1st century.
Right. What, the description I've just given?
No, the description in the Gospels.
Okay.
So that would be an explanation that the this is a made up story basically. There's someone called Robyn Walsh who's a Florida university or something academic, and she has sort of stirred things up by pointing out how Mark was written in Rome, and it does have it's not just a Jewish document. It's written in Greek after all, and there was a big trope in the more classical world, Greek Roman world rather than the Jewish world, of making up empty tombs as a way of showing the importance of the person you're writing about.
Right.
Is something that Richard Price used to talk about, but nobody listened. But no, Robert Price, sorry. She's in her work. She's pointed out there's about 30 examples of when they found the tomb empty, and isn't that amazing? Right. In either novels or in classical literature.
Round about the same period, or significantly later, or
that I'm getting this from when she was interviewed by Mark Goodacre on NT Pod, actually. Okay. And she didn't say. You didn't know. Okay. There's a book. It costs about £90.
Wow.
So maybe wait for it to come out in paperback.
Yes. Well, academic books do normally have quite a higher markup.
Yeah. To me, the women as evidence for an empty tomb just doesn't work. There's the other material of why should there be a tomb at all.
Yeah.
The practice. There is some practice of bodies being taken down from crosses so they're not left hanging overnight as a special thing in Jerusalem or in Palestine. But the picture is that it's very unusual for bodies to be given back to the family of a crucified victim.
Yeah, they just thrown in an open grave, weren't they? Just an open pit.
Well, yes, I think that's what happened to Jesus. But the typical Roman thing was to leave them on crosses and let birds eat them for carrion and that sort of thing. It was absolutely gruesome.
Yeah, horrid. Yeah.
But there's some evidence that in Palestine they did allow for local sensibilities taking bodies down. And I think a communal pit. It says, I am very minded to believe this creed thing, and it does say Jesus was buried. I'm happy to accept that in all likelihood Jesus was buried, but in a rich person's tomb that you could visit and say, it's now empty, that sounds to me highly dubious.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
I think in Alexandria, is it Philo? One author talks about practice, and I think it's around about this time, and it's only on the birthday of the emperor that occasionally people can make special application and be given the bodies of their crucified loved ones. So it's a really special. And right. Jesus isn't just any old crucified criminal. He's an insurrectionist, the worst kind from the Roman point of view.
Right. So
even if they crucified him by mistake, not realizing he wasn't an insurrectionist, that's what they thought he was. And so that would be the laws or practices under which he would have been killed and buried.
Yes, so if they thought he was guilty of that kind of heinous crime, then they wouldn't give special dispensation to that, would they?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Far more likely the petty thief Barabbas.
Yes, that's right. Yes, exactly.
But again, but now that I've brought him up, though, so the Barabbas bit right at the beginning of this whole sordid weekend, is that also something added in to...
I think Barabbas means son of the father or something, so it sounds like made up bloke.
Right.
Joseph of Arimathea also has that name because Arimathea is supposedly a Hebrew town, but actually it means something in Greek, meaning good disciple.
Right.
Good disciple town. So Joseph came from good disciple town.
Right. Okay.
So if you're going to read it as something in Greek rather than something in Hebrew, then that also looks highly suspicious.
Right. Okay. Bit like Clark Kent coming from Smallville.
Yeah. Well, even worse. Good disciple town,
Yeah.
Yeah, he sounds like a made-up character, as you assessed to me.
So with all these little bits plugged in, that's got to be, even with, if we grant some of these minimal facts, with all these other superfluous bits of detail that are plugged in around the edges of the story, it just adds evidence to the suggestion that there's lots of made up stuff here and we can't really be confident about important details. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, and I think with these minimal facts, they don't get you where you need to be if you're an apologist. And so if you're trying to throw in these details, they're not going to be securely confirmed historically at all.
Yes, and I think there's a very key point on that matter is the minimal facts are post hoc rationalization. These aren't minimal facts that have convinced the people that are selling them. These are minimal facts that the people who already believe it are trying to use to sell it to us.
Well, they want to think of an argument, and for years they had an argument based on the reliability of the Gospels, and they realised that as scholarship more and more was saying, no, we can't rely on the Gospels, Gary Habermas had this innovative move to say, OK, let's start again and just talk about facts that scholars do agree with. Can we establish a resurrection from that? He thought he could and wrote his thesis on it, and he's sort of lived on it since. But
yeah, which is weird because I find him an utterly unconvincing person as a character. I've heard him speak a couple of times on a couple of podcasts. I find him totally unconvincing. His style and presentation, sometimes I'm not even sure he believes what he's saying. He's like John Lennox, the two of them. I really find the two of them really unconvincing characters.
Yeah. Okay. Lennox.
Then that's a personal thing.
Lennox, there's something in me that you kind of react to people who you think you aren't reliable, aren't being honest for themselves, put it that way.
Yeah.
I don't react to Habermas that way. He's. I'll try and find it, and so you can put it in the show notes. The Unbelievable episode with him and my man James Crossley, right. I think is excellent. And Habermas is careful not to overextend his case. So I feel he's been quite straight and honest in that.
Right.
He's saying he needs to call in NDEs to establish that people can rise from the dead and that sort of thing.
That's where Habermas loses me, because I know he's a big fan of NDEs, and he loses me at that point completely.
Yeah. But the fact that he admits that you need to pull them in to get over the line, as it were.
Yeah.
To me, he's saying, okay, he's being kind of honest about the actual resurrection evidence from these minimal facts and all the rest of it.
Yeah. But if he needs to pull in something like that, then surely that's tacit admission that the minimal facts on their own aren't quite good enough.
Exactly. That's why I'm impressed with his honesty.
Right. Okay. So he needs a new tactic then.
Yep.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to, because I'm watching the time now, Ed, and we're moving on. Is there anything else that you wanted to pick up on the episode that we discussed, or anything that we might have missed?
There's a little thing which is my hobby horse,
right,
on the resurrection, which I've actually come up with since the Still Unbelievable chapter.
Right.
And that is, it struck me how secret the resurrection events are. Secrecy is a big deal in Mark's gospel. It's a big theme, this secrecy theme that you see. It comes up again and again and again. But actually the whole resurrection is entirely secret, that only a few disciples and women actually experience anything associated with the resurrection. There is there's the guard story, I think, is pretty well the only exception. And that is very few people who are kind of serious scholars give it any time at all.
It's funny, that guard story, that gives me echoes of Paul's release from prison. There's a similar thing there as well. Guard fell on his knees and was converted along with all his family.
Yeah. Well, it's just the idea that guards could sort of say, oh, we fell asleep, and they think they wouldn't get kind of prosecuted for saying, and that the guards were only placed a day too late. So what's all that about? It's all just implausible.
Yeah.
Why would
there be guards anyway?
Yeah. And Matthew does go for some implausible stuff more than the other gospels.
I've always said never trust anyone called Matthew.
Okay. So apart from the guard story, I think all of the resurrection events are completely hidden away with just a tiny number of witnesses. And then suddenly, according to the book of Acts, about 7 weeks later, people are preaching about it. And that's the first time that it's announced to the world, when it's far too late to do any checking. And I'm not sure what checking you could do anyway, because of Jesus was in a communal grave.
Yeah.
So the whole thing, even in its time, was not something that an outsider would begin to believe. It's all just people telling stories.
Okay. So one of the things that's brought out by Christians, and I've heard this argument, so I'm pretty sure you have heard this counter as well, is that if the Romans knew Jesus was dead and these resurrection stories were circulating, they could have just presented the body.
Yeah.
Would the Romans really have gone and gone, oh, well, he's in that pit somewhere. Let's go and dig it up and sift through the bodies until we find the right one. Would they really have done that?
Well, even if there was a tomb that nobody would, if the Romans said, oh, well, here's the body, they say, oh, well, you just planted it. It just doesn't work at all. You dismissed it really well on the episode when you covered it. As Pilate supposed to foresee the spread of Christianity several centuries later and make a move to fend that off.
Yes, quite. What ifs based on modern knowledge are pointless.
Yeah, I thought you were spot on with that.
Oh, thank you. Took me 2.5 hours to get you to say I was spot on. That's what happens when you wear people down.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously I could talk more, but I think all the things that I really get exercised about, or most of them, I've managed to squeeze in somehow.
All right then. Thank you so much, Ed. It was a pleasure to have your original email talking about this. It's always great to talk to you. We should have had you on much, much sooner. Dear listeners, if you don't already subscribe to Ed's podcast, Doubts Aloud, I highly recommend it. Him and his co-hosts are all very thoughtful. Ed's chapter in the Still Unbelievable book is also a chapter worth reading. He is one of the few people who've actually put loads and loads of references and notes at the bottom of their chapter, so it's worth reading just for that. Thank you so much, Ed. We look forward to having you back on again. We'll work out however that will be. It won't be this year, obviously, because we're back in December. Sorry, nearly in December. We're back at the tail end of November. So have a wonderful Christmas, Ed, and whenever we talk to you again next, we'll talk to you then. Cheers and good night.
Thanks. Cheers. Thanks, Matt.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.